Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this new webinar of Fleet Europe, today in partnership with ALD Automotive. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most important topics that vehicle fleet managers like yourself need to handle is, of course, everything linked to sustainability. And when we are talking about sustainability, we do not only mean to electrify your fleet. You better know than I do that sometimes it can be a challenge. So, are you struggling to reduce your fleet's carbon emissions and meet climate goals? Well, probably you are not the only one. But the good news is, we advise you don't let the challenges of going green increase your blood pressure because that's not healthy and it's not necessary. In this webinar, together with the experts of ALD Automotive, you will learn what to do in terms of meeting sustainability goals and this beyond fleet electrification. If you have questions for our experts, you can submit your questions during this webinar via the chat function, because at the end we will have lively Q&A together with our three experts. You already see them on the screen. We have Amélie de Valroger. She is the head of consultancy and EV solutions at ALD Automotive. Also with us today is Pilar Madeira. She is deputy head of consultancy. And finally, we have the pleasure to meet with Stéphane Reny, who is the head of corporate social responsibility at ALD Automotive. I will now hand over to Stéphane, who will start the presentation. And as mentioned, if you have a question, don't hesitate to submit your question via the chat. Stéphane, hello, welcome. Welcome in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending and spending some of your precious time on a topic which is obviously key for everyone. Okay. I am in charge of corporate social responsibility at ALD, which is basically the same as sustainability or ESG, whatever you want to call it. So the idea really is to implement sustainability considerations into all the components of our supply chain. And that, of course, includes the products and services that we deliver to customers. And that's why I'm here today. When reflecting upon this webinar, I start by asking myself, could we have done this in the same terms 4, 5, or 10 years ago? Overall, fundamentally, yes, but there's two things mainly that have changed. And if you can go to the next slide. The two things that have changed are in very basic, simple terms. The fact that now we know and now we see. We know about the impact of mankind and human intervention on the rise in temperatures and climate change. And I will come back to that in a second. And we see physically the impact of climate change as translated into weather disorders and weather events. And that's actually, I think, key in order to boost the awareness and create the sense of emergency that the subject deserves. Next slide, please. So not later than 2 days ago, on Monday afternoon, was released the latest version of the IPCC reports. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a group of international climate experts who have been releasing now their 6th report on climate change measurements and measures to be taken in order to mitigate climate change, building different scenarios. What the latest two deliveries, actually the one from Monday and the previous one, have changed is not on the basic facts. It's on the key message. And the key message is the fact that it is actually urgent to act now. In previous deliveries and in a lot of corporate sustainability declarations and statements, we all have been focusing on 2050 as part of the net zero agenda. Obviously, this is very good, but if we don't manage to curb down emissions from this decade, then it will be basically mechanically impossible to reach climate goals, because we will have built a stock of CO2 in the atmosphere that will actually forbid to reach the objective. So importance of acting now during this decade and start to reduce emissions. We as an industry and as an ecosystem have a particular responsibility. We are objectively part of the problem, us as suppliers and customers and all our stakeholders, because as you know, mobility accounts for a significant portion of CO2 emissions, 15% in Europe. Corporate mobility within that accounts for a significant fraction. We don't have any scientific facts on that. Obviously, we represent, as an industry, a majority of the new car sales, but if you look at the car park in the streets, it's obviously much lesser. A study made in France proved that the overall corporate mobility, so corporate fleets and everyday commuting, represents 6% of emissions in France, which is already a significant number. And it's also quite specific because it's very visible, and it's the only sector whose emissions have actually increased over the past 20 years. So that's from a societal standpoint. From a corporate standpoint, and within your corporate disclosures, you will have discovered, if you are embarked into CO2 reporting, that corporate fleets account for actually a quite significant share of your CO2 emissions, up to 50% of scopes 1 and 2 emissions. For those of you who are located in the services industry and who have no manufacturing capabilities in particular, it can be, of course, much less, but it's anyway a significant lever to act upon. Next slide, please. So we all need to build a strategy to reduce CO2 emissions with short-term milestones. When I mean short-term milestones, it's 2025 and 2030. And then, of course, from that, we'll derive a net zero ambition in line with the net zero scenario. Next to that is not an option or a strategy. No, previous slide, please. It comes an obligation. And there is actually an obligation to disclose on CO2 emissions that will not be optional for most of the corporates attending this call today. And this obligation, next slide please, comes from the enforcement of the CSRD. The CSRD is a new European directive related to sustainability disclosure. It stands for Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It replaces the current directive in force that regulates sustainability reporting, which is called the NFRD. And really the key message here is that CSRD raises the bar in two directions. The first one is that the requests in terms of the scope of reporting, the depth of the KPIs to be reported by law will increase massively. We are talking about more than 1,000 data points to be reported as mandatory across the ESG space, E for environment, S for social, G for governance. Climate metrics and scopes 1 and 2 and 3 emissions in particular will become mandatory as part of that exercise. So reinforced obligations in terms of the depth of reporting. The second change is the enlargement of the scope of corporates that will be impacted by this directive. Today, it is more or less addressing 11,000 corporates in Europe. The figure tomorrow will be around 50,000, so times 4. So on top of the companies which are listed today and subject to NFRD will come other corporates, non-listed large corporates who reach at least 2 of the 3 thresholds that you can see on the slide in terms of number of employees, turnover, or balance sheet size. Listed SMEs as well, and also non-EU companies for the first time. So it will be a phased approach, whereby first in line, logically, will be those who are already subject to NFRD in 2025 for the fiscal year 24 disclosures. And then year after year, a new bunch of corporates will be integrated in the obligation. So that is going to be actually a necessity and something that will be driven both by your finance and sustainability counterparts in your respective organizations. Next, please. So as a reminder, what will have to be reported in very simple terms, and I'm not going to get into the details of that, are scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 emissions relate very much to the company internal operations. One related to fossil fuel consumptions, and 2 related to the consumption of electricity and the CO2 emissions derived by the electricity that is purchased. And most importantly, Scope 3 addresses both the upstream and downstream impact of a corporation in the space of what the corporation needs to buy in order to manufacture the products, and the consequence of the products that each and every of our companies actually are selling. More details, of course, can be available on this. We would need a 2-hour seminar to cover this. So bottom line, next slide, please. What we actually need during this decade is speed and impact. We need solutions that can be implemented quickly, because we can't wait. We need solutions that can have a massive impact. I mean, a solution that can be implemented quickly, but which has little or no impact, is of no use. We need things where we can generate that leverage and curb those emissions by at least 50% by 2030. And we need an impact that can be quantified in practical terms, mostly in terms of CO2 and CO2 emissions. So that's really what ALD has to offer, and what we offer to accompany you with, an end-to-end consultancy methodology that takes you through that journey, and that Amélie is going to take you through just now.
Good afternoon, all. I'm Amélie Valroger. I'm head of consultancy and EV solution. And in my team, we have developed a methodology called My Climate Journey to accompany you throughout this complex exercise to reduce your CO2 emission in the fleet and mobility area. So this methodology has been built with our clients one year ago. And we have tested it with now more than 30 clients, and we get a really excellent feedback from them. So now, since 2022, we have industrialized a bit our approach with digital tools. And what we can see is that our key differentiator is that we offer end-to-end support from the definition to the implementation of your plan. So if we go through all the steps of this methodology, this 5-step methodology, first we define. So we try to understand with you your corporate target, and if you have, target for your fleet and mobility, and how you calculate that. In the steps number 2, the measure, we calculate with you the baseline of your CO2 emission, and we adapt completely to your methodology. So it's completely, tailor-made solution. Then in the third phase, the target, we set reachable target with you based on the readiness of your employees, if they can charge, where they live, etc., and also the maturity of your country and the solution you want to experiment toward electrification, for instance, or mobility solution. And then we make projection to reduce your CO2 and your CO2 baseline. Then the fourth step, the engage. This is one of the most important steps where you need to involve your stakeholder and also your employees. And our recommendation is to start as soon as possible to involve them in your plan. And the last but not least, it's to launch the plan and also to track the result of it, to communicate and to learn from also your mistake from the experimentation of your plan. So this, methodology takes about 3 months. So it's a full methodology, and we can, support you on this end-to-end approach. So I'm going to focus on the 2 main, phase of this methodology: the measure and the target. So first of all, there is a lot of clients who come to see me and say, okay, how do we calculate the CO2 emission related to my fleet? Actually, it's not rocket science. It's like a good recipe. The secret comes from the quality of the ingredient, and here the ingredient is the data. So we need to have a good quality and accuracy of the data. So what do we need? We need to have the mileage. So either it comes from the mileage you have from your fuel card, or if not available, you can also use your contractual mileage. Then you need to have the fuel consumption. So again, it could be the real fuel consumption from your fuel card, or if you don't have access to those data, you can use WLTP data from your OEMs, or if not, if it's all older cars or vehicles, you can use also NEDC, and then you apply a conversion ratio. You need to use exactly the same units, and you apply a uplift to have more accurate fuel consumption. Then you use, it's the key ingredient of the recipe, emission factor, which is different from depending on the powertrain. So for diesel, petrol, or PHEV, it's a different, emission factor. It's the number of CO2 per liter you have consumed. Then you apply the magic of the math here again, and then you get exactly the gram or tons of CO2 emissions. So now you know a bit, more your CO2 emission, the baseline. So you need to take the concrete action to reduce that. And we are here again to support you. So actually, there is different, initiative you can take. Again, it's not rocket science. There is 3 main levers to implement. The first one is just to choose most efficient models, also to have the right shape of your fleet, to have adapted, the right size of vehicles, and to have also greener powertrain. This is the first one, optimize the vehicle selection. What you can do, as also, is to use alternative mobility solution. So what we call the modal shift. So we replace, a vehicle by alternative mobility solution. Actually, we have seen so far that it represents just a small part of our client, of a percentage of the fleet of our clients. But also you can increase a bit also the utilization rate with shared solutions. And the third, lever is to reduce the mileage. And we have seen that also with home office initiatives, with co-working also, and travel limitation. So 3 different levers, but we know also that one is most, more impactful and easier also to implement. This is the first one, because we need to take into account, of course, the CO2 emissions, but also your employee and the cost of this. And if you take into account what we call the planet, people, and profit, it's for us one of the best options. And the beauty of that is that at ALD we can offer a solution on the 3 different levels. So we have different solution. Just on the first level, in the optimization of the selection of the vehicles, we have, of course, ALD Electric, which is a product which integrates EV models, but also charging solution. We can also help you to optimize a bit, the way we drive. So reviewing the car policy with you, optimizing the car list with more efficient vehicles. We can support you also on the OEM tender. And what is really important also is to improve the driver behavior, to limit the acceleration or harsh braking, and to make sure that we maintain correctly the vehicle and we have a good tire pressure. It's going to also make some savings on the consumptions. The Second one is also relating to alternative mobility solution, and we have here again some some products to support you with ALD Move. This is our mobility budget, but also ALD bike or ALD e-bike, and the car sharing to share also the vehicles. And again, on the last also initiatives, we can support you to reduce your mileage, to review also your mobility policy, increase the day per week of home working, and limit business travel. So again, this is a end-to-end consultancy support, and when you have decided the right solution for you, now it's the time to make some projection, to understand, based on the action you are going to implement, what will be the impact on your baseline, on your CO2 emission baseline. And for that, we have developed a tool, a digital tool called My Net Zero Program, which is a really, really fantastic tool, and I'm really proud of it. And with this tool, you can make some projection of your CO2 emissions. So we calculate, as I mentioned, the baseline, but then we make the plan just to land to your target, so your CO2 emission target. So this tool integrates the EV maturity scoring we have in our mobility guide, but also the employee readiness we can get, through a specific survey we can send to your employees. So at the end of the day, the different scenario, the gradual, moderate, or accelerate, and you select the most appropriate one per country or per region, and you have a recommendation plan on order of vehicle per year. And then you know exactly what could be your reachable target. So I think it's a fantastic support, fantastic tool, but let's be really concrete. And we have a concrete case to present you with Pilar.
Thank you very much, Emily. Hello, everyone. I'm Pilar Madeira, Deputy Head of Consultancy at ALD Automotive. And as Emily said, I bring to you today a real case. So this is a project that we conducted end of last year for one of our global pharma clients and to support their sustainability journey. So here is a bit of the context. The target that this company had set for their fleet was a reduction by 46% of their CO2 emissions by the year 2030. The scope is 17 countries and over 2,500 vehicles. And we set ourselves as objectives three main ones. First of all, define the CO2 baseline. The second was to assess the readiness of the fleet, both in terms of the markets and the countries where these cars are being driven, and the population, the driver population, understand how we could get them ready, or how ready they were in terms of adoption of electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles specifically. And last but not least, evaluating the cost to understand the potential impact of this shift. So in the next slide, you will see the CO2 baseline that we were able to create. Given the fact that 2020 and 2021 were typical years, we agreed to use 2019 fleet emissions as the baseline. So you'll see here in this map the geography of the fleet by color of the emissions of the cars in that specific market. And you'll see that the baseline that is used is 4,892 tons of CO2 of these 2,500 vehicles, with an average of 110 per kilometer. So taking this baseline, we were able now to go to the next step, which is the assessment. So as Emily shared, we take into consideration the EV maturity of the countries, so how their charging solutions are, their taxation incentivizing green vehicles, the origin of their electricity, etc., to understand how fast, depending on these markets, we could accelerate this shift. On the other hand, we launched surveys to all these 2,500 drivers to understand things like, do they own a home, or can they have a wall box installed at home? How many kilometers they drive per day? What are their private needs when it comes to a car, size, towing, etc.? And understand as well their willingness, an important point, to move to a greener powertrain or a full battery electric vehicle. In the next slide, you will see the projection we were able to make. So taking into consideration, this is my net zero program. So as Emily said, we took into consideration the population of 2,500 vehicles. We also took into consideration the countries where these cars are driven, as well as the readiness of those drivers. We did not consider any downgrade, meaning we're considering changing one vehicle for its equivalent in segment of the new powertrain. We're also taking into account the same fleet size. We're not reducing the fleet year on year. It's 2,501 to be more precise, from 2022 to 2030, where our projection ends. We're also considering the same renewal cycle. So we're not extending contracts or anticipating contracts per powertrain. We're using the usual already existing duration of this client's car policy. So what you see here year on year in this stack graph are the powertrains and how they shift. So the greener the color, the greener the car. And as you see, as we move towards 2030, the percentage of BEV increases significantly in this fleet. Two things that came immediately to our attention. As you see the line that goes through the graph, those are the CO2 emissions and how they decline over time in this projection. The first thing we could see is that the initial target, which was a reduction of 46% of the CO2 emissions until 2030, actually could be reached between 2026 and 2027. Again, using these same parameters. Moreover, in the initial timeline of the target of 2030, we could actually, with this shift of the fleet, reduce its emissions by 74%. So a much bigger impact than initially targeted, which was a very good news and something to implement in this client. The next step then is obviously, last but not least, the evaluation of the cost. So in the next slide, you will see the cost evaluation that we did for this fleet. So we considered, again, all markets, all vehicles. We evaluated the total fleet spend using a TCO methodology. We used the energy costs with realistic uplifts so that we could consider not only in terms of emissions, and that is the projection you saw previously, as well as the cost, what is the realistic future of this fleet. Second, for all EVs, so plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles, we included in the TCO charging solutions, home charger, and a card and or an app for public charging. This is part of the TCO. And as well, in this block, we included taxation of these specific markets, including, of course, incentives and penalties if they so apply. You have a snapshot, an example of part of this exercise to the right that also considers, very importantly, the same vehicle segment. As the CO2 projections, we did not consider the downgrading of the fleet. And as a result of this, and taking into consideration the EV readiness, market, but as well as drivers, we could see that this shift to a greener fleet with a reduction of 74% of CO2 emissions by 2030 actually had a neutral impact on TCO, more precisely, actually a reduction of 1% of the TCO of this fleet. So a bit as a conclusion, and I'll ask for the next slide, please, we could see the impact of this real case in the three pillars. So there was a very high engagement of the drivers when they were surveyed directly. So we were positively surprised that the less advanced the market was in terms of electrification, the higher the engagement of the drivers. We, from an average of 60% of answers to the survey, we actually reached 80% in some of these markets, with over 50% of the drivers, regardless of their eligibility, raising their hands and saying, I want to be part of this change, I want a greener vehicle. And with the added advantage for this people pillar as well is the fact that in several markets, there was additional benefit to the drivers through benefit in kind for greener cars. In terms of planet, as I mentioned as well, not only did we create a baseline of CO2 to measure against and to report, but we were able to understand that we could have a bigger impact than the target initially set. And moreover, through the driver survey, we were able to identify another lever to explore, which was the fact that several employees in a few markets had raised their hand to understand if they could have access to alternative mobility solutions. And as Emily said, rightly so, this could be an added lever to further reduce CO2 of the mobility policy of this client. And last but not least, in terms of profit, no cost impact, because as you've seen, the TCO impact was neutral and we didn't have an impact on the fleet spend. So overall, very positive for people, planet, and profit. And over to you, Stefan, for the conclusions of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Emily. Just in a few words, and to leave time for the Q&A part, a few takeaways. I mean, it's obvious that this process shouldn't be depicted as an extremely straightforward one or plug and play. It's not. We all know it's not by now. It's a complex journey where we clearly have to act upon different levers. I think, betting or putting all our money on one single horse will not save the problem. It's about activating a whole series of levers within your respective corporations related to car policy, to mobility policy, etc., qualitative and quantitative measures, and so on. It involves a multi-stakeholder approach, obviously, within our respective organizations. Typically, what we see is a project team on the client side involving the CFO organization, sustainability, HR, and mobility management, typically. We always, start by discussing technology and the advantages or pros and cons of BEVs versus PHEVs versus HEVs, etc. It's of course key, but let's not forget behavior. We all know by now that user behavior is actually key. I mean, specifically in the case of PHEVs, but even beyond, in terms of charging habits and charging practices, even for BEVs, charging behavior across different networks is absolutely key, both in terms of carbon footprint and mostly about TCO. So we need to work on that. No one can bring the solution on his or her own. It's a partnership game. And it's an ecosystem game as well. It's a much more complex battlefield than mobility was before. So it takes partners, and that's why we are embarking partners in the charging space. But also on your side, we need to bring on probably a much broader ecosystem than was the case before. All in all, the combination of the various levels that Amélie described earlier in the waterfall graphs should absolutely lead to a reduction of minimum 50% of CO2 reduction in the space of corporate mobility. That is the minimum to be expected by the end of the decade if we want to be in line with the net zero trajectory by 2050. So obviously, ALD is here to accompany you in this journey, and we'll do our share. Thank you very much for your attention. I think now is the time for questions. So I hand over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you also to Amélie and Pilar for the presentation. As mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, if you have questions for the experts of ALD, this is your time. Submit your question via the chat function in this tool. We still have some time to take some questions. A few questions already on my side, and I would like to start with Stefan. Stefan, you are Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at ALD Automotive. In your latest, I think, 2022 report, there was mentioned that you manage around 1.8 million vehicles globally. We also know that in terms of the EV penetration of new orders, that it reached 27% in 2022. This is already a strong figure. It's currently even higher at 35%. So we are seeing the uptake within fleets of fleet electrification. But this webinar talk not only about fleet electrification. I would like to start with you about in what way is ALD itself walking the talk. Can you explain a little bit how you are going as an organization to become carbon neutral and what initiatives ALD has for its own employees?
Right. So first of all, let's get rid of the carbon neutrality language. I very much prefer to talk about reducing absolute emissions rather than a very vague pledge about carbon neutrality that obviously doesn't mean much at a corporate level. So our commitment in our current and existing strategic plan was to reduce our internal emissions by 30% in 2025 compared to 2019. So that's scopes 1 and 2, and even a little bit part of scope 3 related to business travel, to extend a little bit the scope to where we can act actually on a daily basis. The main buckets of CO2 emissions for ALD is largely electricity consumptions from our premises. Because we are a service company, so we are acting upon that to implement, energy efficiency measures and sobriety plans in across the markets. Actually, this has been accelerated during this winter with the energy crisis, so it helped actually in a way. And the second big bucket, of course, and I think that's the topic of your question, is the CO2 emissions from our internal fleet. So the ones that the cars that our staff are driving. So typically here the focus is on electrification of that part, and also the implementation of multi-mobility solution or multimodal solutions where they are ready. So typically we have 11 markets to date in Europe which have a full EV car policy. So all the renewals are going EV. The figure is increasing, of course, month by month, and within that there is a gradual switch to make it BEV only, and to reduce the share of PHEV, which we still see as a valid transition technology, but obviously we know that the future is on battery electric. So that's the core focus. And of course, in terms of renewal rates on our internal fleet, we are way higher the one that we see on customers. It's always difficult because, of course, there is a big lag between order take and deliveries on the market today. So what we know internally from our order take will only reflect into deliveries or registration in 6, 12, sometimes more months, and so it's sometimes very difficult to interpret.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. Also, my second question, sorry Pilar and Amélie, but also my second question, I think is for Stéphane, because you are the one explaining the elements around greenhouse gas accounting and scope 1, 2, 3. Now, probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, registering or reporting on scope 3 emissions will be for many companies and also fleet managers and finance directors the toughest cookie to crack. And for sure, if we think about accurately registering commuting, what do you recommend as ALD to your customers to make sure that those scope 3 emissions and that commuting pillar is well registered?
That would take a 2-hour seminar in itself. No, I mean, where I would agree typically is that scope 3 is by far the most technical, and it's endless actually, because when you actually pull the string, actually it's basically your entire value chain that comes with it. So what I would say to make it short is really to apply as a first step the principle of materiality. Given the business model on each and every of our clients, and including ourselves, we know that some parts of scope 3 will be much more material than others, and we need to address those and quantify those and calculate baselines for those as a priority. So we know that by nature some of our clients will have quite a significant share of their CO2 emissions in employee commuting, and then we can try to assist them in assessing that It's much more complex than on corporate fleets, obviously, because we need to respect all sorts of GDPR principles in terms of surveying their daily patterns and so on and so on. But we've tried to approximate that for our own purpose, actually, and we are more than ready to test that in POC mode with some clients and accompany them in that process.
Okay. A few questions popped in around charging. I'm going to bundle them. So the first one is, dear all, one of the biggest challenges we face is to charge BEVs at home. First, in case of street parking, and second, in case of difficulties with owners in flats and garages and so on. What would be your recommendation to take this hurdle? Someone?
Yeah, I can take it. Actually, yes, the objective we have with our preferred partner ChargePoint is to offer a really simple solution, and the objective is to offer a possibility to charge at home, at the office, and also on the road. And to do that, we are working with them closely those days to offer the same solution with a single reporting and a single, a tool to use that. And I think it's really important also to have the clarity on the cost related to that. But as you mentioned, also the accessibility. We know that charging at home, it's quite simple when you live in a house. Of course, it's easy to implement. But when you are in the city center, living in an apartment, it's really, really complex. And it depends on the also regulation you have in your country. So sometimes you can, you need to have landlord approval. You need also the assembly of the people of your building just to get the authorization. And we know that, going forward, it will be easier. There is regulation which is this process. And so it will be easier to do so. But our recommendation today is to offer, the three possibility. If there is we're struggling at home, of course, we need to, to reinforce the possibility to charge at the office or on the road, in the public network, but also, of course, to limit the cost related to that. So today, the solution is not, perfect because the maturity of the countries related to the network and the possibility and the regulation also with this, condo regulation is improving step by step. But what I recommend is not to stop electrification for this, small, pain points. Yeah, there is still solutions.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may add to that, Stephen, sorry. The fact is that though we do have a bundled solution, car and home charger for those drivers, as Emily said, who are eligible, not everyone needs to charge at home to be eligible for a battery electric vehicle. It depends on their particular needs as a driver. So it's part of the assessment and the work we do with our clients to understand, we have tools for that, to understand if that is the case or not. So driver behavior, driver eligibility is a very important step because it enables us to identify those cases that on paper can't go to BEV, but actually have that possibility.
Okay. Does this also mean, for example, that it could be a good idea that if you have office chargers, that you have a system where perhaps you give preference to those BEV drivers that cannot charge at home?
Definitely.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, could be a solution. Could be a solution, and you can also have a kind of pre-booking system also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We continue. What do you say to fleet managers that perhaps have an issue with drivers, with people asking for a home charger and how to manage it? I think in terms of is it the company that needs to pay it, the reimbursement, and so on. Any ideas, tips that you can give? So the question is how companies are supposed to manage the request from drivers of having charging box at home.
You mean, Stephen, people who has already charging box, wall box at home?
No, I think that.
Okay.
So I think that if you have a request, yes,
Okay.
how do you deal with it and how do you manage it?
Okay. So I need, first of all, you need to anticipate and to have a common, policy and to integrate that in your car policy. It's really important to anticipate that and to anticipate also the processes and the cost of them. So in order to offer also to your employee a seamless, journey, seamless implementation. Actually, what we recommend, it really depends on your target again. But if you want just to speed up a little bit your electrification, we recommend you to take that step. To handle this step for your employees. So just to reimburse the installation, to fund the wall box at home, and to reimburse also the energy which is going to be used also for the company cars. But of course, you need to adapt that depending on your budget, but also your targets.
Good. We continue. One of the additional challenges regarding charging, this is what a question that came in, is that many corporates use multiple lease codes and there is no real standardization in the offering. Is there some positive news on the horizon in terms of standardization in the offering when it comes to EV charging? Perhaps not only with the lease companies, but perhaps also with the charging suppliers?
Actually, today, if I can take it, actually today there is no offer like this where you can use exactly the same charging solution when your fleet is and you work with different, lease companies. But it's a dreaming, solution. Actually, it's feasible to do so, and we are thinking about a way to facilitate the electrification of our clients, which are in this situation. So nothing, official right now, but we are working on that, on the facilitation of this electrification step.
Okay, good. Then there is a question that popped in about there seems to be a huge increase of battery electric vehicles in the UK. Do you feel that this is also the case in Europe and that the charging infrastructure is keeping up to the demands of the drivers?
You can take that one, maybe. I mean, clearly the UK is a country where we see the fastest acceleration, largely due to benefit in kind taxation, not only, but so you see the same kind of increase in mainland Europe, but clearly the growth figures in the UK is particularly impressive. Actually, at ALD level, the UK is by far our biggest contributor in terms of BEVs in deliveries in 2022. So we see the same thing in our own activity. When it comes to the availability of public charging infrastructure, I think, I mean, yes, we can argue that there is not enough public charging available. However, I think, I mean, my personal take on that is that there's too much noise about this. Firstly, because 80% of charging occurrences happen in on private grounds, whether in the office or at home. And that's sometimes even higher than 80%. So we can help solve this 80% of the problem. Second, I think most of the issue focuses on the number of points, and I would tend to argue that it's not so much a question of numbers and planting flags or planting charging infra. It's about the access to that and this notion of interoperability. Because if you have a lot of charging points, but if you either as a driver have only access to 20% of them, or if you need to carry 5 or 6 different charging cards to have any sort of probability to charge, then it becomes useless. So I think that the focus, the absolute focus, needs to be on the operability of the charging network. Unfortunately, the industry, the charging industry, is very mature, and everyone is protecting their own ground. So there will have to be regulation forcing that. And clearly, that's what the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive is targeting, to install this interoperability. It will not be tomorrow, but soon after, and that will be a massive enabler. Plus, the same AFIR is containing binding targets for all member states in terms of the number of public charging points that should be available according to the EV car park on the road. And when I mean binding targets, it's not something that European or national parliaments can then dispute and renegotiate, if you see what I mean. It's something that will come top down as an obligation, and that will also help massively in terms of BEV uptake.
Okay. Both Amélie and Pilar, in your presentation, you mentioned with the assessment of the customer that you also look at the EV readiness of the countries. I know that I think last year or the year before, that both ALD and also the company that you are about to acquire published EV readiness for many countries in Europe. Can we expect in the upcoming year a new EV readiness report for your customers?
Well, I can take that. Actually, every year we launch at ALD the Mobility Guide towards Q4 usually. And that's where we indeed publish not only the EV readiness, but then the information per country on where we are. Obviously, this score evolves based on the information and the data that we have access to. Even between 2021 and 2022, we stopped scoring 5 points when we included an additional one, because we saw for the first time parity on TCO between BEV and ICE in a few markets. So what I can answer that is likely the score will continue to evolve as hopefully the situation of the countries evolve, and what we wish for is to have more countries in the green, so the highest maturity level, so that we can also help those markets to push faster towards BEV.
Okay. A question that popped in. You mentioned during the presentation that one of the ways to bring down the emissions was also to focus on driving behavior. How do you help today your customers monitor in a good way this element?
I can take it. Yeah, actually, I've mentioned in the presentation that we can work on that. And actually, there is different way to do that. Either it's the carrot or it's the stick. Mm-hmm. And what we recommend, it's just to clearly set up the rules with your driver. So explain, for instance, that for when you have a PHEV, you need to prioritize, of course, the electric, mode rather than, the ICE mode. And you need also for that, you can have, there is different solution. You can limit, cap the number of fuel tank that you are allowed to do per month, to take per month. There is also, I mentioned the maintenance. I think it's really simple to do that, but just to respect, the maintenance plan can also save, fuel consumption and also CO2 emission. The same thing for the tire pressure. It's impressive, and we have, some analytics and some, outcome of the initiative we take. We can save up to 15% of your fuel consumption if you just follow those rules. So And again, you can also have some initiative like a recommendation of home office, or also there is a way to use your car just when you need it, and to prioritize when it's possible, of course, public transport or bikes. So different initiatives, but also we need to adapt to your needs and to your your concrete usage. We can do the same thing, and there is not a magic solution to be implemented in every company. So we need just to adapt that to your organization.
Okay. Do we still use the car too much? You have the impression?
Actually, today we know that around 80% of the journey are made with a car. So it will take time to change the habits. Of course, we can change, but today, as I mentioned in the presentation, what we call the shift, the modal shift, today it's only it represents only 3% of the employees. Of course, we can improve a bit better, but today we need also to work on the public transportation, the access to different shared solution. So there is different way to improve that, but it will take time. And again, it's a question of impact and and speed and ease of implementation.
Okay. One question that also always comes back is around plug-in hybrid vehicles. Okay. So apparently, in many analysis, also I think in the graphs that you showed, Pilar, with the customer, in some countries, the cost, the CO2 emissions, and the TCO for PHEV were higher, for example, than ICE, presuming perhaps that they were not really well used. Now, going further on that, often indeed we hear that PHEVs are not always used in the best possible way to be really green, let's say. Okay, so how would you recommend PHEV drivers to increase the share of electric driving and not just, go for petrol or diesel?
Yeah, so that's a good one, and as you said, quite recurrent. I think first and foremost, we need to understand that when we talk about driver eligibility, we're not talking about just identifying if that driver is eligible for a BEV. There is an eligibility factor for a plug-in hybrid as well. For example, in these cases, particularly the possibility to charge at home. A PHEV needs to be charged every chance possible, at home, at the office, at the supermarket, wherever it stops. Because in fact, if it is not in electric mode, is worse than an ICE, because it's a bigger, usually bigger and heavier car. So our suggestion is first, and when we have situations where clients have completely scratched PHEVs from their fleet, we advocate for a stable approach with some of the let's say, structured support and awareness, as Amélie said, a clear policy on how it can be used, on who is eligible, limitations of how much fuel it can be expensed per month if you have a PHEV. Because we know that if we provide, on one hand, the carrot, which is, as we advocated earlier, the possibility to charge and reimbursement, for example, of a wall box, and the stick by removing the possibility to fuel that car on its ICE element, then we are enabling the good behavior. But as again, PHEV is not for everyone. It should be part of the eligibility check as well.
Okay. Of course, you have many customers, international customers, big customers. They are not only having passenger cars. Many of them, for example, also have a mixed fleet, have light commercial vehicles. It can be even a tougher cookie to crack, wanting to reduce emissions, going electric with your LCV fleet. What would be your recommendation to those people that perhaps at this moment can't find the ideal models or have issues in seeing what they can do in terms of turning their LCV fleet completely green?
Yeah, actually, transitioning to a LCV, full electric LCV fleet is harder. We know that because it's linked to the business, and you earn, money with those vehicles. So that's really important for you, and so you need to limit, downtime and also loss of revenue. If there is, a wrong, move, and you need just to monitor this transition. So what we recommend first is to look at the usage of your vehicles and your needs. So look at the mileage, concrete mileage, ideally with telematics, if it's possible. Also, you need to look at the payload. So how much weight are the driver actually carrying? And also the operating location, where they are going, what are their journey, are they in or around low emission zone, and also where they can charge, really important. So for that, of course, the telematic is one of the solutions, but we can do that also without that. And then on the offer, I think there is more and more models. So you need to be to be updated on the last model. And today there are now ELCV covering every segment size, and they are available overall. So they are good models, and you have solution in every segment. So it's possible, okay, and you need to select your fight to again start where it's easier to charge, where it's easier based on your usage. So step by step, phase out the approach.
Okay. The question regarding the presentation of Pilar. Pilar, you mentioned an interesting case study. And I can imagine that for cost efficiency reasons, many fleet managers would like to consolidate suppliers, also brands. At the other hand, if you want to go EV, knowing that we are still coming out of that supply chain issue, it might be interesting to open up the car policy and to allow more brands than before. What would be your recommendation to find that balance, let's say, between on the one hand consolidation and try to limit the suppliers, at the other to stimulate electrification but also the motivation of the employees?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that we often engage with our clients. There is no right answer. I think first and foremost we need to understand, and it's an exercise we do very frequently, to understand how the industry is doing, and I'm talking about the industry of that client, and that speaks to talent retention and talent acquisition. We know specifically in several industries that this is a key point. The car is very visible. So depending on what's happening, we can also advise our client on where we see the trend going. But I think in the end, it's a balanced approach. There are efficiencies to be gained as well in terms of cost for concentration. There is potentially a balance between what can be considered working tool cars and pure benefit cars. So there is an analysis to be done, and certain segments can be more concentrated in a few OEMs. Usually those segments are segments where we have volume, and potentially enable others to have a wider scope. But again, it's something that we need to look into with our clients, assess the TCO impacts, and we are very much used to, I think Amélie mentioned that, to conduct and manage OEM tenders to understand exactly where those efficiencies are. So where the balance between simplification of process, so a concentration, but also attractiveness in terms of HR and TCO optimization.
Yeah, and actually, if I may add something here, I think also in selecting your OEM partner, you need now to add some new criteria. Of course, it's we need to add the criteria of the EV offer, also the CO2 footprint strategy, the supplier's dependency, delivery lead time, and also the commitment on the pricing condition. So that's really important. So we can also support on this, on this part, and it's really important to improve a little bit the way we are selecting our OEM partner.
Okay. A final question. We know that Europe is a patchwork of countries, patchwork of legislation. In some countries, there might be more skepticism in terms of opening data towards suppliers, towards the community, even internally. You talked that it's very important to listen to the customer, but also to listen to the drivers. So you mentioned surveys. How can you assess those surveys ensuring GDPR compliance?
That's a good question. We don't need access to any personal data to do a driver eligibility, or what we call fit for green. We have solutions, and our tools are anchored in those solutions that enable us to define not only the questions that we want to send to the drivers, and we do that with our clients, but launch the survey through our platform. It's actually launched by the client, but through our platform, and we only get the anonymized results. So the survey is anonymous. We get the results. We can take care of the data and complete security, and we never have access to the personal data of the drivers. We are also used to as well going through the process of discussing this with HR. In the engage step of this methodology is extremely important to involve these areas early in the initiative, early in the project, and this way we can establish what we can do, what's the level of comfort, involve works councils if need be, so that when we launch, it is clear the why. And as I shared in the study and in the project that we did, it shows the impact. Drivers are, in all the surveys that we've done, extremely happy to be included. They answer very fast. They answer en masse, and their feedback is invaluable for the transition as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. We need to end this webinar, this interesting webinar here. I would like to thank ALD for the support, and like to thank the experts, Pilar Madeira, Amélie de Valroger, and Stéphane Reny. And of course, I hope to meet with you in an upcoming initiative from Fleet Europe and ALD. Ladies and gentlemen, as you have seen, this was a very interesting and informative webinar. This webinar also underlined that both ALD and Fleet Europe take sustainability at heart. So for us, it's really an important topic. You also saw that we are in the middle of this electrification journey. We are not just talking about electrification, but the goal is to become as sustainable as possible. Whatever some associations might say, I think that our industry is really well weaponed to lead fleet electrification and the complete sustainability journey. Also at Fleet Europe, we will continue with the fleet sustainability journey. In fact, you are all invited for the Global Fleet Conference from 15th to the 17th of May in sunny Portugal, where the overarching topic will be sustainable procurement. I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I hope to meet with you in an upcoming event of Fleet Europe. Thank you. Bye-bye.